In the shadowy aftermath of World War I, Germany was a nation teetering on the edge of collapse. Humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, plagued by economic despair, and torn apart by political chaos, the German people were desperate for stability. It was in this climate of uncertainty and fear that Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising a new era of national revival. But beneath the surface of his nationalist rhetoric lay a darker intent, one that required absolute control, silence of dissent, and the elimination of any perceived threats to the Nazi regime. On April 26, 1933, just weeks after Hitler was appointed Chancellor, the groundwork for that control was laid with the formation of a new secret police, the Gestapo. Short for Geheimstaatspolizei, the Secret State Police. Initially created by Hermann Göring, then the Minister of the Interior for Prussia, the Gestapo's primary mission was to track down and eliminate political opposition, particularly communists, social democrats, and anyone who dared to speak against the growing influence of the Nazi Party. At its inception, the Gestapo was not a vast organization. It was a regional force limited to Prussia, with limited personnel and resources. But Göring's ambitions quickly outgrew local borders. He recognized that to maintain control over an entire nation, a centralized and ruthless intelligence force would be necessary. However, rather than expand it himself, Göring transferred control of the Gestapo in 1934 to Heinrich Himmler, a loyal Nazi who was already in command of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, Hitler's elite paramilitary organization. Himmler, with his cold, methodical approach, immediately understood the Gestapo's potential. Under his command, and with the operational genius of Reinhard Heydrich, the Gestapo evolved from a provincial secret police into a terrifying national institution. Within months, it was integrated into the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Main Security Office, where it operated alongside the SS and SD security service. This fusion of state and secret power marked the beginning of one of the most feared surveillance and enforcement systems in modern history. Heydrich, who would later be called the Butcher of Prague, refined the Gestapo's methods with chilling efficiency. Files were kept on ordinary citizens. Informants were recruited from every walk of life. Even private conversations at home could be reported and punished. The mere suspicion of anti-Nazi sentiment was enough to warrant arrest and, in many cases, disappearance. Thus began a campaign not only to silence political enemies, but to remake society itself in the image of Nazi ideology. The Gestapo would go on to infiltrate schools, churches, workplaces, and homes. It would operate without judicial oversight, and it would strike without warning. The seeds of tyranny had been planted. The Gestapo, once a tool to quell rebellion, was now becoming the engine of state terror, its cold, invisible hand, ready to grip the throat of a nation. From the very beginning, the Gestapo was designed not just as a law enforcement agency, but as an invisible weapon, sharp, silent, and swift. By the time it was placed under the control of Heinrich Himmler and molded by the cold hands of Reinhard Heydrich, it had become something far more sinister than even Göring had envisioned. This was no longer just a state police force. This was the beating heart of Nazi repression, Hitler's personal instrument of fear, a secret police empowered to operate outside the bounds of law, accountability, or morality. Imagine living in a world where the law does not protect you, it hunts you, where the people knocking at your door in the middle of the night do not have warrants, do not need reasons, and certainly do not leave explanations. This was the reality crafted by the Gestapo. Under Hitler's direct authority, the Gestapo became a law unto itself. A decree in 1936 removed it from the jurisdiction of all courts, effectively placing it above German law. There was no need for due process, no trial, no defense. If the Gestapo suspected you of harboring anti-Nazi thoughts, yes, even thoughts, you could be arrested, detained indefinitely, and subjected to horrific interrogations. all without ever stepping into a courtroom. And this was not rare, it was systemic. The brilliance and the horror of the Gestapo was how efficiently it turned ordinary citizens into cogs in its machine. A casual complaint from a neighbor, a misinterpreted joke at work, a disagreement overheard in a cafe. Any of these could spark an investigation, and once you were on their radar, escape was nearly impossible. Even the innocent had reason to be terrified, because innocence was not protection. Suspicion was enough. Once detained, victims entered a world ruled not by justice but by psychological warfare. The Gestapo's interrogation rooms were not just places of violence, they were chambers of psychological ruin. Victims would often be held in soundproof cells placed deliberately near the interrogation rooms of others. The screams they heard were part of the process, meant to shatter their will before the questioning even began. And when it began, it was merciless. The Gestapo used a wide range of techniques, some physical, many mental: sleep deprivation, starvation, simulated drowning, beatings. But perhaps most terrifying was the threat of harm to family members. A father might be shown a photo of his wife or child, then told exactly what would happen to them if he did not confess. This was not interrogation. It was calculated psychological torture, and it left thousands of people shattered beyond repair. But fear was not confined to those detained. It spread like a virus through society. People began censoring themselves not just in public, but even at home. Parents warned their children not to speak freely, even within the walls of their own house. Husbands and wives hesitated before sharing their thoughts. Everyone was a potential informant. The Gestapo encouraged this paranoia, cultivating an environment where betrayal was not only expected, it was rewarded. One letter, one whispered conversation. That is all it took. To make matters worse, Gestapo agents themselves were faceless. They did not wear uniforms. They blended into crowds, sat quietly in theaters, attended church services. You never knew who they were or when they might be listening. That ambiguity was intentional. The Gestapo did not need to be everywhere. It just needed people to believe it might be. Fear did the rest. And perhaps the most chilling part, all of this was perfectly legal by Nazi standards. The Gestapo did not break the law. It was the law. It did not enforce justice. It enforced loyalty. Its mission was not to protect the public. It was to protect the regime. Everything else was collateral. This transformation from a regional police force to Hitler's untouchable weapon of terror did not happen overnight. It was gradual, methodical, and deliberate. And that is what makes it even more terrifying. It was not a coup or a sudden collapse of freedom. It was the slow, careful erosion of rights, one decree at a time, one silence at a time, until suddenly no one dared speak at all. The Gestapo did not just crush resistance, it preempted it. It made people police themselves, their families, and their friends. It created a society where fear was baked into the routine of life, where quiet compliance was the only path to survival. And what began in Berlin quickly spread across Nazi Germany and its occupied territories. The model of surveillance and suppression that worked so effectively at home was exported abroad with even deadlier consequences. In places like Poland, France, and Czechoslovakia, the Gestapo set up local networks, county-opted collaborators, and began their brutal campaign of interrogation, arrest, and execution. The organization that had started as a tool to suppress a few political opponents had evolved into a continent-spanning machine of terror, one that helped pave the way for genocide, mass deportation, and the systematic destruction of entire communities. So ask yourself, how does a nation, how do people reach that point? It does not start with concentration camps. It starts with silence, with turning away when a neighbor disappears, with accepting that the state knows best, with surrendering tiny freedoms in the name of security. That is how it starts. And that is how the Gestapo thrived. Their power came not from numbers, but from the fear they instilled. Fear that made people betray their own. Fear that forced obedience. Fear that killed the soul of a nation before a single shot was fired. That is what happens when power answers to no one. When the law serves tyranny instead of justice. That is what happens when you create a secret police. They were only 16,000, give or take, but their shadows stretched across an entire continent. Imagine that, a force no larger than the population of a small town, yet capable of paralyzing a nation of over 70 million. This was not power by numbers. It was power by fear. The Gestapo did not need to be everywhere. They only needed you to believe they were. And in that belief, they found their most dangerous weapon. There was no escape from the paranoia, no safe space. Your home, your school, your place of worship, none of them were immune. The Gestapo had infiltrated not just the streets, but the minds of the people. Their genius and their cruelty was in understanding that real control does not come from brute force. It comes from turning a society against itself. How do 16,000 men control tens of millions? They do it by making millions think they are being watched. At every moment. In every place. Informants were the blood that kept the Gestapo's heart pumping. But these were not always trained spies or hardened collaborators. Many were ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, students, teachers, even children. Some informed out of fear, others out of loyalty. A few were driven by hatred, but the most chilling of all were those who betrayed simply to settle a grudge. A jealous co-worker, a suspicious neighbor, a spiteful ex. In Nazi Germany, a whispered accusation carried more weight than a courtroom verdict, and the Gestapo listened. They encouraged it, fostered it, turned it into policy. The effect was suffocating. People learned to live with masks, smiling in public, speaking in code, avoiding eye contact with the wrong kind of neighbor. Every interaction was calculated. Every relationship was a risk. You never knew who might be listening, who might be watching, or who might decide today was the day to denounce you. And the most terrifying part, it worked. When a neighbor disappeared, you did not ask questions. When a coworker was arrested, you said nothing. Silence became a survival instinct. The Gestapo did not need massive prisons or long court trials. Most of the time, they just needed a knock at the door. That knock was enough to destroy a life. Take, for example, the story of the Hodzik family. Yugoslav immigrants living in Berlin, peaceful and law-abiding. One night in 1942, without warning, the father was taken. No charges, no explanation, just gone. The family searched, pleaded, asked anyone who might know something, but no answers came, only silence. The message was clear: do not look too closely, or you might be next. That is what the Gestapo did best. They did not just punish resistance, they destroyed hope. What made this system so effective was that it did not need a Gestapo agent on every street corner. The fear of them did the work. That is why people call it psychological terror. The mind became the battleground. When people are scared to speak, scared to think, scared to feel, you do not need an army. You have already won. And the Gestapo knew this. They cultivated it. They built a reputation so ruthless, so precise, that even their absence felt like presence. Their name alone carried weight. Parents used it to scare children into behaving, teachers used it to silence students, employers used it to maintain discipline. Everyone knew someone who had been taken, and no one wanted to be next. Inside this fog of fear, the Gestapo thrived. They did not need evidence. They did not even need a reason. Suspicion was enough. A vague accusation, a poorly timed joke, a foreign-sounding name. That is all it took. Once the Gestapo had you in their sights, it rarely ended well. But what is perhaps even more horrifying is how the people adapted. They internalized the rules. They watched what they said, censored their thoughts, trained themselves to blend in. Survival depended on not standing out. And so slowly, quietly, the very spirit of a nation was choked. This was not just a police force. It was a virus, infecting the psyche of the population, rewriting the very nature of social trust. Friends did not confide in each other. Families kept secrets from one another. Communities were broken down into isolated, fearful individuals. And that is how 16,000 men controlled millions. The Gestapo did not need a massive infrastructure. They built their empire inside people's minds. Their strength came not from force, but from fear. And fear, once planted, grows on its own. You have already heard about the fear, the knock at the door, the whispers in the street, the silence in the face of disappearances. But nothing compares to what happened after the knock. Because once the Gestapo had you, they did not just want answers, they wanted submission. They wanted to break you, and they had perfected how to do it. Inside the walls of Gestapo headquarters, like the infamous one at Prinz Albrechtstrasse 8 in Berlin, interrogation was not an act of discovery. It was a performance of domination, and you, the prisoner, were the audience and the victim. The first thing they took was time. You did not know if it was day or night. Your watch, your sense of routine, even your name, those were peeled away, layer by layer, until you were nothing more than a body in a cell, waiting to be called. But even before the first question was asked, they began to work on you. Sometimes the cell was placed near the interrogation chamber of another prisoner. Not by accident. They wanted you to hear the screams, the sobbing, the desperate begging, every sound a message. This is what is coming for you. And even if you had not done anything, especially if you had not done anything, it did not matter. You would confess eventually. Everyone did. When they finally came for you, it was not with a legal procedure or a clear accusation. It was with a look, cold, detached, like you were already guilty. And they were not here to find the truth. They were here to make it. They called it enhanced interrogation. But there was nothing enhanced about it. Just pain, delivered with clinical precision. Beatings were common. Belts, sticks, fists. And not in rage, but in rhythm, methodical, practiced. The interrogators were not wild. They were professionals. They did not lose control. They were control. Some prisoners were kept awake for days, their minds unraveling thread by thread. Others were starved, left in complete darkness, or stripped naked to humiliate them into compliance. And if the physical abuse did not work, they turned to something even worse. Threats. "You do not have children, do you?" they would ask, pretending to glance through a file. "That is lucky. We would not want anything to happen to them. But if you did have children, a wife, a brother, then the real torment began. They would read you their names, their addresses, their school schedules. The message was clear. We do not just own you. We own everyone you love." Some prisoners broke quickly. Some held on. But eventually, almost everyone signed something. A confession, a statement, a blank sheet of paper. Anything to end the horror, because in that world, truth did not matter. The Gestapo did not need real confessions. They needed obedience. And for the rare few who resisted to the end, the Gestapo had a final option: disappearance. Many victims never made it out. They were sent to concentration camps, executed in secret, or simply vanished into the vast bureaucratic maze of the Nazi regime. Families were given no answers, just silence. Maybe a letter weeks later, maybe nothing at all. The cruelty was not just in the violence, it was in the ritual, the cold efficiency. Every step of the process was designed not just to punish, but to erase. One survivor, held in Berlin, recalled how interrogators played classical music during beatings, not to drown out the noise, but to make it worse. The contrast between beauty and brutality was intentional, a reminder that they controlled even the atmosphere of pain. And what is even more chilling is how ordinary the perpetrators were. These were not monsters in the traditional sense. Many were middle-aged men with families. Civil servants in uniform. They went home at night, kissed their wives, played with their children, then returned in the morning to break another human being. This is what makes the Gestapo's legacy so terrifying. Not just the violence itself, but how normalized it became. How torture was turned into paperwork. How suffering was categorized and logged. How people, real people, became shadows in files, numbers on forms, stains on the walls. And it is important to remember, this did not happen in the Dark Ages. This happened in modern times, in cities with libraries, orchestras, and universities, in a country known for its philosophers and poets. That is how thin the veneer of civilization really is. Peel it back, and if the conditions are right, this is what you find underneath. So the next time someone tells you that something like this could never happen again, remember the Gestapo, and remember how many people said that exact same thing, until the knock came at their door. They did not need spies in trench coats or agents hiding in alleyways. The Gestapo's greatest asset did not wear a uniform, it wore a neighbor's smile. What made the Gestapo so terrifying was not just their authority or their cruelty. It was how they turned an entire population into their surveillance network, not through loyalty, not even through ideology, but through fear, suspicion, and desperation. They blurred the lines between the hunter and the hunted, between victim and accomplice. Imagine living in a world where your neighbor might report you for staying up too late with the lights on, where your coworker might whisper your name to the authorities because of a passing comment in the break room, where your child, yes, your own child, might come home from school and, eager to please their teacher or their country, mention something you said at the dinner table, and imagine that being enough for a knock at the door, enough to disappear. In Nazi Germany, you did not need to commit a crime to be arrested. All it took was someone saying you might have. One letter, one accusation. That is how the Gestapo operated. It was not justice, it was paranoia. And they fed it. They encouraged people to report suspicious behavior. Posters, newspapers, even school teachers reminded citizens it was their duty to keep the Reich safe, to expose traitors, to report unpatriotic remarks. You did not need evidence. You just needed to be willing. And people were, some informed out of genuine belief in Hitler's vision. Others acted out of fear, afraid that if they did not report someone, they would be reported themselves. But perhaps the most unsettling were those who did it for personal gain. That promotion you wanted, that apartment you coveted, that grudge you had been carrying. A well-timed accusation could make problems disappear literally. And once the accusation was made, there was no taking it back. The Gestapo did not need to verify it. They did not need to ask questions. Their entire system was built on the assumption that where there is smoke, there is fire. Except the smoke was often just the result of envy, rivalry, or blind panic. This culture of suspicion corroded everything. Trust vanished. Friends drifted apart. Families grew quiet. Parents whispered warnings to children. Couples spoke in code, or stopped speaking altogether. Because once the idea took root that anyone could be listening, everyone became a threat. There is a chilling quote from a woman who lived through it. She said, "We stopped talking. Not because we had nothing to say, but because we no longer knew who we were saying it to." The Gestapo did not just monitor behavior, they engineered it. People began to self-censor out of habit, out of fear, out of survival, and the more they feared each other, the less they resisted. It was brilliant, in the most horrific way, a society that policed itself, fueled by its own anxiety. And it worked. Reports flooded in daily. Tens of thousands of denunciations, many anonymous, landed on the desks of Gestapo officers across Germany. Some were long-winded essays, outlining a neighbor's daily activities. Others were scrawled notes, one sentence long. She said Hitler was crazy. He listens to British radio. They still talk to Jews. That is all it took. One of the most famous cases involved a man who was arrested for making a sarcastic remark about Hitler's mustache. A friend had overheard it and felt obligated to report it. The man was interrogated and later sent to a camp. His friend, he never saw him again. Even in prison, the paranoia followed. Some inmates were planted informants, pretending to be fellow prisoners. A kind word, a shared secret, a moment of trust. These were traps, designed to extract more names, more targets, more fear. But perhaps the most heartbreaking were the betrayals within families. Children, especially, were vulnerable. Indoctrinated from an early age in the Hitler Youth, they were taught to value the Reich above everything, even their parents. Teachers encouraged students to report un-German behavior at home. Some children did it proudly, believing they were helping. Others did it accidentally, not realizing what would follow. And some did it because they would been taught not to feel guilt. There are documented cases where fathers were arrested because their children mentioned a joke told at the dinner table. Wives turned in husbands. Brothers betrayed brothers. The Gestapo did not have to dig for secrets. They were handed over on slips of paper. And once someone was taken, the silence began. Those left behind rarely asked questions. If your neighbor vanished, you did not knock on the door to ask why. You did not call the authorities. You did not visit their family. You stayed quiet. Because you had to. Because asking was dangerous. Because next was always just one word away. This is how a small group of agents, just 16,000 strong, controlled an entire nation. They made fear a language, a currency, a weapon. And they taught the population how to use it on each other. By the time people realized what had happened, by the time the war ended and the atrocities were uncovered, the damage was done. Trust had been broken. Communities had been shattered. And the silence that once kept people safe had become a silence filled with ghosts. The Gestapo did not just monitor Germany. They rewrote its soul, one whisper at a time. By now, we have seen how the Gestapo built its empire on fear, betrayal, and silence. But all of that, every whisper, every interrogation, every knock at the door was leading to something much darker. Because the Gestapo did not just want to control thoughts. They wanted to cleanse society, to erase those they deemed unworthy. And in doing so, they became one of the most critical instruments in carrying out the Holocaust. They were not the only ones pulling the strings, but they were often the ones making the first move, arresting Jews, dragging them from homes, loading them onto trucks, and sending them into the unknown. It is easy sometimes to imagine mass atrocities as distant, faceless events, but genocide does not begin in gas chambers. It begins in living rooms, in neighborhoods, in offices. With a visit from the Gestapo, their targets were clear: Jews, Roma, the disabled, political dissenters, and anyone who did not fit the twisted ideal of Aryan purity. And when the Gestapo came for you, there were no second chances. One of the most well-known victims of this machine was a teenage girl hiding behind a bookcase in Amsterdam, Anne Frank. She and her family had been in hiding for more than 2 years. The secret annex was small, silent, filled with fear. And yet somehow Anne found the courage to write, to hope, to dream. But in August 1944, that fragile world was shattered. Betrayed by an anonymous informant, the Franks were discovered and arrested. It was the Gestapo who carried them away. Their crime, being Jewish. Their punishment, transport to the camps. Anne's diary, survived. She did not. But her words, written in secret, have become a voice for the millions who were silenced. And in those pages, we see the true horror of the Gestapo, not just in what they did, but in what they stopped from ever becoming. They did not just kill lives, they killed futures. The Gestapo's role in the Holocaust was systematic, methodical. They maintained meticulous records, filed deportation orders, coordinated with the SS, and ensured that Jews across occupied Europe were rounded up with chilling efficiency. Trains did not just leave by accident. Lists did not fill themselves. And, final solutions do not carry themselves out. Someone had to knock on doors. Someone had to open them. And all too often, that someone was wearing the black coat of the Gestapo. Take Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, in November 1938. On that night, Nazi officials unleashed a wave of violence against Jewish communities across Germany and Austria. Synagogues were burned, Jewish shops looted, and more than 30,000 Jewish men were arrested. Who carried out those arrests? The Gestapo. Swift, ruthless, unapologetic. They did not just enforce policy, they embodied it. Later, when ghettos were emptied, it was often the Gestapo who led the roundups. When names appeared on lists bound for Auschwitz or Treblinka, the Gestapo ensured they got there. They were the iron fist behind the bureaucracy, the enforcers of Hitler's vision, masked as lawmen. They operated not just in Germany, but across all occupied territories, in Poland, in France, in the Netherlands. Their presence was a death sentence for those who dared to hide, resist, or simply exist in the wrong skin. Entire communities were erased one raid at a time, and still the Gestapo did not just aim for bodies. They aimed for belief. In every operation they sought to destroy more than life, they wanted to destroy hope. In the Warsaw Ghetto, when resistance fighters rose up in 1943, it was the Gestapo, alongside the SS, who led the violent suppression. Flamethrowers, machine guns. Buildings set alight while people hid inside. It was not enough to defeat the resistance, they wanted to obliterate it. But the most terrifying part, they believed they were doing the right thing. Many of the officers saw themselves not as monsters, but as patriots, as guardians of a twisted order. That is what made them so dangerous. Evil does not always wear horns. Sometimes it wears a badge and files reports. The post-war trials would later expose the depths of their involvement, the files, the testimonies, the memories. But justice, if it came at all, came too late for the millions who never returned. And yet, amid all the terror, there were still glimmers of resistance. People who hid their neighbors, forged documents, lied to save lives. Ordinary people risking everything to do what the Gestapo could never understand, care for someone different. These acts of courage did not stop the Holocaust, but they proved something that still matters today. Fear is powerful, but it is not invincible. As we look back on what the Gestapo did, we must resist the urge to think of it as history buried in the past. Because the structures they built, the tools they used, fear, silence, division, those things never truly disappear. They simply wait. And if we forget, they return. So remember Anne Frank. Remember the millions who had no voice. And remember the knock that always came too soon. Because the Gestapo was not just a secret police force. It was what happens when hatred is given a uniform and humanity forgets how to fight back. They did not wear masks. They did not lurk in shadows. And yet the terror they unleashed reshaped history in ways more devastating than any battlefield ever could. Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, and Heinrich Müller, names that do not always echo as loudly as Hitler's, but names that forged the Gestapo into the coldest weapon of the Nazi regime. They were not just commanders, they were architects, engineers of fear. and their blueprint was one of silence, submission, and absolute control. You see, the Gestapo did not begin as the monstrous machine we now remember. It started with ambition, with calculation, with the cold genius of men who understood that power did not just come from weapons, it came from paperwork, from procedure, from turning terror into something that looked like order. Himmler, once an unremarkable chicken farmer with a bookish face and a quiet voice, climbed the Nazi ranks not through charisma, but through obsession. Obsession with control, with racial purity, with the dream of a Germany purged of everything and everyone that did not fit his twisted ideal. In 1934, he seized control of the Gestapo, but he did not turn it into a tool of brute force overnight. No, he made it something far more insidious. He made it official. Under Himmler, the Gestapo became the arm of a state that claimed legality while abandoning morality. Arrests were documented, deportations filed, tortures authorized through neat stamps and elegant signatures. The violence was not chaotic, it was scheduled. The atrocities did not happen in alleys, they happened in offices. And they were carried out by men in uniforms, who spoke in terms of efficiency, not empathy. And then came Heydrich. If Himmler was the engineer, Reinhard Heydrich was the sharp edge, a man Hitler once described as having the heart of iron. He was young, brilliant, and utterly ruthless, tall and refined, with the posture of a naval officer and the mind of a bureaucratic predator. Heydrich had a gift for turning ideology into action. He understood how to take Hitler's broad, hateful vision and break it down into practical steps. It was Heydrich who masterminded the administrative framework that enabled the Holocaust. He chaired the Wannsee Conference in 1942, where the final solution was laid out with horrifying clarity. Around that table, genocide was discussed not with rage, but with chilling calm. Heydrich used terms like resettlement and evacuation, masking murder behind euphemism. This was not madness, it was logistics. He restructured the Gestapo into an extension of Nazi ideology, using surveillance, intimidation, and calculated violence to crush resistance before it could breathe. His motto was not strike hard, it was strike smart. And yet, his reign was cut short. In 1942, Czech resistance fighters, trained by British intelligence, struck back. They assassinated him in Prague, and the Nazis responded with monstrous fury. Entire villages like Lidice were wiped off the map in retaliation. Women and children executed or deported. The Gestapo made sure of it. Then came the final piece. Heinrich Müller. Gestapo Müller, as he was often called, not because he was the most famous Müller in Germany, there were many, but because he was the one history remembers. Cold, precise, and invisible, Müller was the embodiment of the faceless terror the Gestapo spread. He did not make speeches. He did not chase headlines. He managed lists, files, arrest orders. And under his direction, the Gestapo reached its peak of bureaucratic brutality. Müller did not need to shout to be feared. His memos killed. His reports condemned. He operated like a surgeon in a morgue, quietly dissecting society, removing what the regime labeled as disease, political dissidents, Jews, gay men, Jehovah's Witnesses, anyone who deviated from the ideal. And no one ever saw him coming. When Berlin fell in 1945, Müller vanished. Some believe he died in Hitler's bunker. Others think he escaped. His body was never found. His name was never erased. His legacy, stamped in red ink across tens of thousands of death certificates, remains. What made these men truly terrifying was not just the violence they directed. It was how normal they made it all seem. They wrapped their crimes in protocol. They built a government where genocide had its own department, where torture had guidelines, where children's fates were decided, in morning meetings between coffee breaks. They proved that horror does not always scream. Sometimes it signs a form. Sometimes it wears glasses. Sometimes it looks like your uncle, your teacher, your neighbor. The Gestapo did not just act with brutality. They acted with efficiency. And that efficiency came from these three men, who saw no contradiction between filing paperwork and burning villages, who believed the future belonged only to those willing to erase the present. And here's the most chilling part. The systems they built, the forms, the surveillance, the silent compliance did not die with them. After the war, many of their methods were studied, mimicked, even admired by future regimes. The Gestapo became the blueprint not only for Nazi terror, but for how any government could maintain control without ever raising its voice. As you watch this story unfold, ask yourself, how many horrors in history began with a form, with a name on a list, with a silent nod across a polished desk? Because Himmler, Heydrich, and Müller did not need to scream to be heard. They built a machine that spoke for them one knock at a time. They were not just hunters of thought, they were executioners of hope. As the Gestapo's power expanded beyond Germany's borders, so did their cruelty. In every corner of occupied Europe, wherever courage flickered, the Gestapo arrived like a storm to smother it. They did not just crush resistance movements, they dismantled communities. They erased towns. They made examples out of heroes. And nowhere was this more horrifyingly clear than in the rubble-strewn streets of Warsaw and the silent forests of Czechoslovakia. Let us start in Poland, the place many now call the graveyard of Europe's conscience. After the Nazi invasion in 1939, Poland was carved apart like a corpse on a table. But unlike other occupied lands, the Poles did not yield quietly. From the very first days of occupation, resistance movements formed brave, decentralized, and desperate. Underground newspapers circulated. Secret schools educated children in basements. Messages were passed by candlelight and code. It was a defiant heartbeat beneath the crushing boot of Nazi rule. The Gestapo, of course, was listening. Every whisper, every leaflet, every act of defiance became a red dot on their maps. And then came retaliation. Palmyra, a name you might not have heard, but you should. Just outside Warsaw, in a quiet forest, the Gestapo established an execution site. Not a camp, not a prison, just a clearing. From December 1939 onward, thousands were brought there. Polish teachers, lawyers, priests, poets, entire families, accused of spreading anti-Nazi sentiment, of being a part of the resistance, sometimes for nothing more than possessing a banned book. Lined up, shot, buried in mass graves. No trials, no goodbyes. And then came the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, a desperate, brave attempt by Polish fighters to liberate their capital as Soviet forces lingered nearby. For 63 days, they held the city against overwhelming odds. Makeshift hospitals sprang up. Children ran messages between firebombed buildings. Civilians became soldiers. It was one of the most powerful acts of urban resistance in modern history. But the Gestapo, alongside SS units, retaliated with inhuman fury. Entire neighborhoods were leveled. Hospitals were set ablaze with the wounded still inside. Captured fighters were executed in public squares. Civilians were rounded up by the tens of thousands, men, women, children, and deported or murdered on the spot. In the Wola district alone, over 40,000 civilians were slaughtered in a matter of days. The Gestapo did not just want to stop the uprising. They wanted to erase the idea that it had ever existed. Now, shift the lens to Czechoslovakia. When Reinhard Heydrich, the butcher of Prague and one of the architects of the final solution, was appointed Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, he brought with him the full weight of Gestapo strategy, efficiency, surveillance, fear. Resistance in the Czech lands was strong, but the Gestapo was already embedded deeply. Informants sat in cafes. Agents monitored phone calls. And when the Czechoslovak government in exile, with British support, launched Operation Anthropoid, an audacious mission to assassinate Heydrich, it was a moment that stunned the Nazi world. On May 27, 1942, resistance fighters attacked Heydrich in Prague. He died from his wounds days later. The response was biblical in its brutality. The Gestapo, seething with vengeance, descended on Czech villages like avenging gods. The most infamous case was Lidis. Lidis was a peaceful village, a place of farmers, schoolchildren, and small-town quiet. It had nothing to do with the assassination, but the Gestapo needed an example. On June 10th, they arrived. They rounded up every man and shot them on the spot. Women were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Most of the children were taken away. Many were later gassed. Then the Gestapo burned every building to the ground, bulldozed the ruins, wiped Lidis from the map. And they did it not just to punish, but to warn. A warning in fire and blood, a message to every other village, every hidden fighter, every silent sympathizer. We will find you, we will end you, and we will destroy everyone you love. This was the Gestapo's war outside of Germany, not trench warfare, not battlefield honor, but shadow operations, collective punishment, psychological warfare backed by real horrific force. In France, they hunted members of the resistance with terrifying accuracy. In Greece, they oversaw massacres of entire towns. In the Netherlands, they were the ones who opened the door to Anne Frank's hiding place. Every occupied country had its own story, its own cemetery built by Gestapo decisions. And yet somehow, they kept the mask of bureaucracy. These were not wild men with blood on their hands. These were officials in pressed uniforms, seated behind desks, filling out forms. That is what makes it all so haunting. It was not chaos. It was a system. Massacre was not the failure of the Gestapo. It was their function, and it worked. For a time, the resistance movements were pushed into deeper shadows. People whispered more softly. Villages closed their windows at night. The Gestapo had proven they would go to any length to maintain control, even if it meant killing entire towns, even if it meant wiping names and homes from the earth. But there's something else, too, something the Gestapo never understood. Even in the face of all that destruction, resistance never truly died. The memory of Lidis became a rallying cry. The ruins of Warsaw became a symbol. And those who survived, those who lived through the brutality, carried the truth forward. Because while the Gestapo believed they could silence rebellion with fear, they only proved how terrified they were of something stronger defiance. The Gestapo could kill bodies, but they never quite managed to kill the will to resist. They say the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he did not exist. But the Gestapo did something even more insidious. They convinced a nation that they were its protectors. For all the brutality, for all the whispers and disappearances and death trains in the night, the Gestapo were not always feared. Not by everyone. Not at first. To many ordinary Germans, at least. Those who stayed silent. Those who looked the other way, they were seen as the guardians of peace. The shield against chaos. The last line of defense against the so-called enemies of the state. How? One word. Propaganda. From the very beginning, the Nazi regime knew that violence alone was not enough to maintain control. Terror might silence dissent, but it does not buy loyalty. So they turned to stories, to radio broadcasts, newspaper articles, films, posters, and speeches, each carefully crafted to blur reality and feed the lie. The Gestapo was not a brutal secret police force. No, they were portrayed as loyal civil servants, as tireless patriots keeping Germany safe from criminals, communists, traitors, and Jews. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Picture this: a mother in Munich reading a paper that warns of underground Bolshevik plots to poison water supplies. A radio broadcast crackling with tales of Jewish conspiracies. A film at the local cinema showing brave Gestapo officers uncovering sabotage and betrayal, always just in time. The message was constant, inescapable, and terrifyingly effective. The Gestapo is watching, yes, but only to protect you. And many believed it. It was easier to believe it. Safer, because the truth that these officers could take your husband, your friend, your neighbor, and never explain why was too terrible to face head-on, so people looked away. Or worse, they joined in. Informing on others was not just encouraged, it was framed as patriotic. Reporting a co-worker who told an off-color joke about Hitler was not betrayal. It was helping keep the fatherland pure. One of the most chilling effects of this propaganda was how it blurred the lines between villain and protector. In classrooms, children were taught that Germany was surrounded by enemies, that traitors lurked in every corner, that the Jew, the Roma, the disabled, the deviant, they were the reason Germany had suffered after the First World War. The Gestapo was not punishing them, they were cleansing society, keeping it strong, keeping you safe. You might be wondering, how could anyone fall for this? How could a thinking adult justify what was happening around them? But stop and ask yourself, how many lies do we accept because they make us feel secure? How often do we excuse cruelty when it is wrapped in flags and uniforms and the promise of safety? That is exactly what the Gestapo relied on. They did not need to kick down every door. They just needed enough people to believe that when they did, they were doing it for the right reasons. A powerful example of this manipulation can be seen in the 1940 Nazi propaganda film, titled Gestapo. Yes, that was the actual name. In it, the agents are clean-cut heroes, saving Germany from foreign spies and internal traitors, the villains, intellectuals, Jews, socialists. In other words, the same groups the Gestapo was hunting in real life. Audiences left the theater applauding the very organization that, weeks later, might drag someone from their home at midnight. That is how propaganda works. It does not change the truth, it buries it, and in its place it plants fear, pride, and false safety. The effect was devastating, because while the Gestapo tortured prisoners behind closed doors, their image on the street remained polished. While they enforced racial laws and organized mass deportations, they were still invited to community events, still treated by many as civil servants, doing a hard but necessary job. In a twisted way, the Gestapo became both the executioner and the therapist, causing trauma, then comforting the public by saying, "This is for your own good." And, make no mistake, this perception mattered. It gave the Gestapo permission. It allowed their actions to continue without mass revolt. It made it easier to build lists, to gather names, to sweep people away without having to explain. The propaganda also served another critical function. It isolated victims. If you were arrested by the Gestapo, many Germans did not see you as a victim. They saw you as guilty. Why else would you have been taken? The logic was circular, but it was convenient. It excused apathy. It justified silence. Anne Frank's family was not arrested by monsters, in the eyes of many. They were arrested by officers doing their job. That is what the posters said. That is what the films showed. That is what the neighbors repeated to themselves, so they could sleep at night. And by the time the war ended, and the truth finally emerged in full, many could not believe it. Some still can't, because propaganda does not just lie to you once. It rewires how you want to see the world. That is why the story of the Gestapo is not just about violence. It is about image. about the careful crafting of a monster that looked like a protector, about how evil is not always loud, or ugly, or obvious. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it wears a clean uniform. Sometimes it tells you that you are safe so long as you do not ask questions. And that is why we tell this story now, not just to remember the victims, but to stay vigilant. Because propaganda never really dies. It just waits, ready to dress up fear as protection, ready to tell you who the enemy is, ready to turn the next neighbor into a suspect, and the next knock at the door into a sentence. History warns us. The question is, are we still listening? In the end, the Gestapo did more than terrorize a continent. They left behind a blueprint, a symbol, a warning carved into history, deeper than any bullet or bomb crater. Their name, short and clipped, still sends a chill down the spine, not because of what they did alone, but because of what they represented. The terrifying potential of a government unleashed from morality, cloaked in legality, and armed with silence. By the time the Third Reich crumbled into ash, the Gestapo had disappeared from the streets, but not from the story. In post-war trials, many of their leaders vanished or took their own lives, leaving behind questions that would haunt generations. Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule. Mueller was never found. Others blended into civilian life, escaping justice, protected by the very secrecy they once used to destroy others. But the legacy they left was impossible to erase. They became a symbol not just of Nazi Germany's cruelty, but of all state-sponsored terror. When people speak today of the KGB in Soviet Russia, they invoke the same specter: hidden eyes, midnight knocks, forced confessions. When historians recount the horrors of Japan's Kempeitai, the secret military police infamous for torturing civilians in China, Korea, and across Asia they draw the same lines: surveillance, fear, brutality wrapped in bureaucracy. It is not just the tactics, it is the structure, the cold efficiency, the psychological warfare that makes neighbors whisper and children mistrust their own parents. It is the fear that does not need to scream, because it has already taught you to stay quiet. The Gestapo did not just punish dissent. They engineered compliance. And that is perhaps the darkest truth of all, because even now, echoes remain. In regimes that silence journalists, in countries where citizens disappear without trial, in societies where propaganda paints enemies out of the innocent, and fear is the price of safety. And those echoes ask us the question the Gestapo never needed to answer. What happens when power faces no resistance? They showed us what it looks like when laws serve violence instead of justice, when patriotism is weaponized, when a police force becomes a political blade slicing away opposition, rewriting truth and punishing not just action but thought. But they also revealed something else, something the Gestapo never intended. They revealed the limits of fear. For every family they shattered, there were whispers of resistance. For every village they erased, there were stories that survived. Diaries hidden under floorboards, messages scrawled on prison walls, names remembered by neighbors who refused to forget. Even Anne Frank arrested, deported, and killed, left behind words more powerful than the officers who took her. Her voice endured, theirs did not. History did not bury the Gestapo in silence. It exposed them, and it is up to us to keep doing so. Because the lesson is not just that they were evil, it is that they were possible, built not by monsters, but by men in suits, by citizens who stayed silent, by systems that looked legitimate on paper, but were designed to destroy. Today, the Gestapo stands as a dark mirror. When we see governments justifying surveillance in the name of safety, look in the mirror. When we hear of police forces acting without oversight, look in the mirror. When fear becomes normalized and dissent becomes dangerous, look in the mirror. The Gestapo may be gone, but their warning remains. Never forget what happens when power becomes absolute. Never forget what happens when fear is used as glue to hold a society together. And never forget how quickly it can all begin with a list, a whisper, a name. Because once, not long ago, in cities filled with music and art and life, a knock at the door after midnight was all it took, and a nation turned to silence. Let that silence be broken now. Let the memory of the Gestapo stand not as just another chapter in history books, but as a fire alarm, a symbol not of strength, but of the fragility of freedom, of how easily it can be traded for comfort, or stability, or fear. That is their final legacy, not one of victory, but of warning. Not a triumph, but a lesson. And that lesson is simple: never again.